So let's start the lecture. This is, as I mentioned, Strategic Creativity for Innovation, Neurobiology of Learning and Creativity. And we went through the first half of the course, the fundamentals and history, from the definition of innovation, the different types of innovation, the very fundamental paradigm that we've been using for innovation, namely biology and evolution, history of innovation, moving on to the scientific method, historically and in practice, and then finally more recent examples of innovation ecosystems in Silicon Valley and Israel. So now we begin the second part of the course, which is methods and applications, and the first topic will be neurobiology of creativity and learning. And the discussion period that we had went over this question: what method or technique do you find especially helpful to learn things? Many of you mentioned about writing things down, reviewing, creating summaries, flashcards or small cards, looking at things visually. And at the end of this lecture, I will share with you a technique of learning that is very powerful and is also related to innovation. So as a very quick review, I want to discuss last week's lecture, in which we talked about the two big issues: the Great Divergence between East and West. What are possibly some of the reasons for that as it relates to innovation? And we talk about two innovation ecosystems very quickly, of Silicon Valley and Startup Nation in Israel. So the Great Divergence is a concept that after the middle of the 19th century or so, what were previously pretty equal gross domestic products, pretty equal wealth, pretty equal economic strength between the East, namely India and China, and the West, namely Europe, diverged significantly after that time. And so we're talking about what was originally maybe a factor of 2 difference in per capita GDP, resulting in a factor of 50 over the course of that two and a half centuries. And of course, more recently, that divergence has been markedly narrowed, but this is called this Great Divergence, and it's been a topic of great historical interest. It's the topic of great policy interest for governments as they try to continue to build economic strength. And the central thesis is one of the reasons for this Great Divergence, as it's called, is innovation. So an ongoing debate why England was first to industrialize, and after the industrial revolutions, how did that progress? So some of the reasons for this Great Divergence, just to summarize: we had differences in physical environment, culture and religion, political and social institutions, markets were fairly well developed in both regions, and an early advantage of technology in particular by Asia was not maintained. And in particular, central argument is that that technology advantage, the new invention, was not applied across the board in society, and hence did not innovate. So a difference in innovation is one important reason for that Great Divergence. Then we moved very quickly to the Silicon Valley ecosystem that actually has many different areas. For example, media, social media in San Francisco, biotech in South San Francisco, Software City in Redwood City, venture capital in the Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park, Stanford University, startups in Mountain View, and on the east side of the Bay, Fremont, and a lot of factories and manufacturing facilities to support that ecosystem. And we also emphasize that in Silicon Valley, there were many different waves of innovation corresponding to different technologies, originating in the early part of the 19th century with a vacuum tube, then HP with test equipment. After World War II, microwaves and defense, integrated circuits with Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel, and that's where the term Silicon Valley, of course, comes from. Then in the 1980s with Apple, with personal computers, a little bit with life sciences, particularly in South San Francisco, then the internet in the 1990s, and then social media more recently, and artificial intelligence presently. So these are different waves of innovation. Silicon Valley is a very key area for disruption, where many of the large companies valued disrupt traditional businesses. We've heard about, of course, Facebook and Google disrupting classic media, Airbnb with hotels, iOS and Android with regular phone systems, Apple and Pandora and Spotify with music, Netflix with Hollywood, Uber with taxis, and so forth. So that's a concept of disruption, replacing existing businesses that we talked about earlier. And the ecosystem involves many different parts, including professional services, financial support, mentors, angels, and all of the components going from very early stage companies to later stage companies. A lot of so-called incubators and startup areas often just have more focus on early stage and don't have a lot of the other elements of the ecosystem to support the full range of companies as they move forward. Similar ecosystem concept we reviewed in Israel, which has a wide range of companies in a wide range of industries, and also large companies and small companies. And that startup nation, or the Israeli ecosystem, has many components again: the government, large companies, corporate spin-offs, research institutions, incubators, academic institutions, defense industry, venture capital, experienced entrepreneurs for mentorship, and the pool of managerial talent, and all of that goes together in a very confined area. So now let's go into today's lecture, which is on the neurobiology of creativity and learning. And we'll talk about three parts: some background of neurobiology. Then we'll talk about the actual neurobiology of learning, in particular a concept called long-term potentiation. Many of you in your answers talked about review and writing down, and those techniques of learning are very related to how the brain learns and the neurobiology of learning. And then we'll talk a little bit about the mind and creativity. So when we answer the question, what is one of the key methods you use to learn a new idea, topic, or subject, leads to the interesting question, what actually is learning? And one of the paintings that I like best is a painting from Paul Klee, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And Paul Klee was a Swiss painter in the early part of the 20th century. And he has a painting which I like a lot, which is One Who Understands. So if you look at this painting, it looks a little bit strange, but you know, what are some of the aspects of this face that expresses this concept of understanding? Because fundamentally, learning is not just memorizing information. When I'm talking about learning, it's understanding and having a deeper access, if you will, to the meaning of that material, not just repeating it. So understanding is actually the goal. And some of you mentioned about being motivated or having a certain interest in what you're learning. And so there's also a very important emotional component to understanding and to learning. And I think that is what is captured in this painting. It is a kind of emotional calmness, a kind of satisfaction, almost a little bit happy, but it's not the same as happiness, that one feels, and that's the emotional component, when one understands. And that's my interpretation. So this also leads to another interesting question. Why am I showing this painting of Paul Klee in a lecture about learning and understanding? Well, I came across this painting when I was in medical school in the United States. I went to Columbia, which is in New York City. And they have, of course, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is where this painting is, in New York City. And many times to study, namely to learn, I would actually go to the museum to study. So I would take my books, go to the museum, and I'd look at the artwork a little bit, but I would sit down in front of some of the art in the galleries. It was during a weekday, not a crowded weekend. And I would study in the, among all the art. And so that was a little bit strange. Most people go to their desk, they go to the library, but I wanted to create a kind of different environment related to this motivation. And one of you mentioned about learning in 25 minutes and then resting and then coming back. So I wanted to be in an environment where I could study, and then when after half an hour or 25 minutes, I would go and look at some artwork and kind of expand my mind and go back to the study. So I think this is a very interesting point, painting, because it expresses some important concepts about the human element of understanding and the feeling related to that. And it also is an example of one of my methods for learning, and I'll talk about that more later in the lecture. So let's start with some background. So the brain is composed of nerve cells, neurons, and there are two types of neurons or neural cells. There are the neurons themselves and what are called glial cells. And the basic functional unit of the brain are these neurons. They are the basic unit of structure and function for the nervous system. And the most notable quality of these neurons is irritability. And that's the ability to produce an electrical response or action potential in response to an external stimulus or in response to signals from other cells. The second type of cell, the glial cells here, are generally serving a supporting function in the nervous system. So we're going to focus on these neurons. So what does a neuron look like? Neuron, this is a prototypical or typical neuron. It has two parts. It has a cell body or soma, and it has an extension called an axon. And local impulses or small electrical activities arrive in the dendrites and the soma, the body. And these impulses are transmitted. They go down to the next neuron via very large electrical changes called action potentials. So small electrical changes or local potentials come into the body of the neuron called the soma, and the large electrical changes or action potentials go down the axon. So this resting potential is a difference in charge from the inside and the outside of this neuron on the cell membrane. And that difference in charge is generated by different ions across the neuron, and it's about minus 75 millivolts, predominantly potassium ion. And then this action potential, which is a very large shift in the membrane potential, goes from negative, as I described here, to positive. So literally, the cell switches in its charge state from negative inside to positive inside. And that action potential has four characteristics. One is there's a threshold. There will be a certain point where it will suddenly go. Below that, we have those small changes. And above this threshold, we have the large changes. The other important aspect of this action potential is it's time limited, fairly circumscribed, so we call these spikes. The third one is there's no decay between spikes. And the fourth one is it's an all or none or digital type of response. So this is how the nerve cell communicates with these electrical changes. So local potential, action potential. And that's what it looks like in action, as it were. So going from negative to positive, all or one, remember we mentioned that, spike, time limited, and then returns to the resting potential. So different neurons will also communicate via what's called a synapse, or a connection between these neurons. And this is the action potential, and this is the second neuron or postsynaptic neuron. And so this structure here, which is a connection between the presynaptic and the postsynaptic neuron, that's called a synapse. And at this synapse, in the postsynaptic region, three things can happen. You can either get a small electrical change. Again, that's called a local potential. We can get a big electrical change. We call that an action potential. Or you can get some biochemical changes in the postsynaptic neuron. These biochemical changes are the basis or neurological basis of learning. So when you're learning, and later on we're going to talk about innovating, but when you're learning, you want to make those biochemical changes in your neurons. And we're going to talk about the details of that. And that's basically the neurobiological basis of learning. So let's go back. We'll talk about this some more, but let's go back to these synapses. So there are two types of synapses, generally speaking. There are electrical synapses, in which the action potential, the large electrical change, is directly transmitted from presynaptic to postsynaptic neuron. These electrical synapses are designed for very quick transmission, and you can imagine, because they're just electrical transmission, they're not actually involved in learning. They don't really change much. They don't have these biochemical changes we talked about. The second type of synapse is called a chemical synapse. And in this case, this action potential, just like here, comes down and causes chemicals to be released from the presynaptic neuron. Those chemicals, or neurotransmitters, or transmitters, will travel across the synapse to then bind or attach to the postsynaptic cell. We call that diffusion and receptor binding, and then these various actions. So this is an example. You can see it's now negative here in the presynaptic cell. It suddenly goes positive, then causes the transmitter to release, binds to the receptor, and then you see the action in the postsynaptic cell. So these connections are related to learning, and the strengthening of these connections through these biochemical changes in the postsynaptic cell are related to learning. So let's zoom in on this synapse. So this is, we call this synaptic learning. So before learning, the presynaptic cell releases the transmitter that we described. It binds to the receptor, and there's various activities, or actions, I should say, that take place in the postsynaptic cell. So this is before learning. After learning, you see there are more receptors in the postsynaptic cell, and there is a strengthening of that connection. So this is a very simple depiction of what we term synaptic learning. So in these chemical synapses, there is some biochemical changes, some cellular changes in the postsynaptic cell. So the experiments that validated this concept are called long-term potentiation experiments. And you would basically do a stimulation experiment and stimulate the neuron A and record the result in the postsynaptic cell in neuron B. And before inducing long-term potentiation, which would be repeatedly stimulating A, so you strengthen this synapse before you induce the long-term potentiation. This would be the result in B. The result would be kind of small. This would be the electrical change. It would go from minus 70 millivolts to maybe minus 65 millivolts. EPSP is excitatory postsynaptic potential. Excitatory means going more positive. After the learning, after strengthening that synapse, after those biochemical changes that we described, you do the stimulation in neuron A, and you see the result is almost twice as big in neuron B. The EPSP, or the potential change, is minus 60 millivolts instead of minus 65 millivolts in cell B. So that strengthening of the synapse. So many of you are giving answers to the discussion question about reviewing, repeating, and summarizing and writing down and so forth. You are, in a way, strengthening these connections in a focused way. And actually, I told you I went to Columbia, and one of the professors, he got Nobel Prize for this type of work that has demonstrated the neurobiological basis of learning. His name was Professor Eric Kandel, and he was actually my professor back when I was in school. So some of you mentioned about resting and studying for about 25 minutes and then maybe resting. And there's also a very close connection between sleeping and learning. So many students, I remember myself, would stay up all night studying, and you know, it was very painful and so forth. But in fact, you can do a lot of learning by sleeping as well. So sleeping, resting is very important. So a certain cycle of learning is very important. Not just continually learning, but so when I was in the museum for 25 minutes, half an hour, I would then take a break and in a sense, allow this biochemical change process to occur. I would look at other things and then come back and study, and that reinforcement, sort of making it forget a little bit and then reinforcing, created this extra motivation to strengthen those pathways. Whereas continuously, you know, solidly, unchangingly, you know, reviewing something without that break is less effective. And that's related to this concept. So when you're awake, you get the synaptic potentiation, learning, and you get much more synaptic density by the time the rest of the day is ended. And then at night, you actually are forgetting, and you have a synaptic homeostasis, memory consolidation, and decreased synaptic density and strength. So you actually, in a sense, forget things, but strengthen those things which you had taken special care to emphasize during the course of the day. So this is the learning process, synaptic density increases, and then during the sleep process, these are refined. They're not exactly the same as what you had before. So this resting process and moving away from the learning and coming back to it is extremely important. So another example of learning in neurobiology is also seen in the immune system, how we develop immunity. And there are close parallels between the nervous system and the immune system. And the immune system is literally a system for learning. Everybody's talking about COVID-19. If you have immunity to COVID-19, what does that mean? It means your body remembers that you had the virus. and that's a form of learning. The immune system is learning about the exterior world by exposure to that exterior world. And a vaccine induces that learning process artificially. So how does the immune system develop? Well, we have two parts of the immune system. We have the central immune system, and we have the peripheral immune system. The central immune system, which is the thymus, which is behind the sternum in the middle of the chest here, and the bone marrow, produce what are called T and B cells. And they produce a lot of cells in what's called an antigen-independent fashion. And the antigen-independent fashion is a way of producing all the different cells that can respond to a very or near infinite number of viruses and pathogens. But that's not really learning. It's almost as if you were born and you knew everything about mathematics, biology, history, economics, politics, as if you knew everything, which is not really learning. And it's not very efficient. So this antigen-independent proliferation basically creates an immune system that's responsive to everything, but not very efficiently. The peripheral nervous system, which is the outside, the lymph nodes, the tissue underneath the skin, the spleen, the tonsils in the throat, the billions of immune cells that you have will be proliferating in what's called an antigen-dependent fashion. In other words, the cells that proliferate and gain strength are the ones that are exposed to the environment. We call that antigen-dependent. So that's how the body, the immune system, learns about the environment. The cells that are responding to the environment grow more than the cells that are not responding. So if you've been exposed to chickenpox, if you have had the measles vaccine, if you've been exposed to COVID virus, you will have more of the cells that respond to those pathogens. So the adaptation to the world, the learning, takes place in this antigen-dependent fashion. So that's very interesting, is learning has to be exposed or tested with the real world. Remember in the beginning, we talked about the definition of innovation. Innovation was not just creating new ideas, but it was exposing those new ideas to the real world and testing them with the real world and making them sustainable in the real world, right? So this is like invention, antigen-independent proliferation, and application or testing is the red box, the antigen-dependent proliferation. So this is what we see if we have antibodies produced for an antigen, like a virus. For the first time, we call that the primary response. We get a certain number of antibodies. If we get the antigen the second time, we have many more antibodies, and we call that the secondary response. This secondary response is much stronger, and that's what we call immunity. So the body has learned about the outside world. So when we do learning, there are two types of learning. There's passive learning, just rereading. Some of you mentioned highlighting, cramming, and most of you realize that this passive type of learning doesn't really last a long time. The active form of learning, making a diagram, many of you said writing down, some of you mentioned visual learning, drawing to reality. This is more important for long term. And so we have conventional learning, mastery learning, and adaptive learning. And this adaptive learning, many of you mentioned doing something and doing it in the real world and connecting to reality. That's this adaptive learning. So here's a technique that I want to share with you about learning. And I call it linear versus logarithmic learning. And this is a graph of, let's say, the number of brain cells used. I put it in quotes. This is a very conceptual idea. You could also say number of synapses made. So that's on the vertical axis is the number of brain cells used. The horizontal axis is the amount of knowledge learned. And there are two ways to learn. One is linear learning. So if you learn twice as much information, you need twice as many neurons, right? Or twice as many synapses. If you learn Boyle's law, which is that the pressure and volume of a gas are inversely related. The pressure times the volume is equal to a constant, that Boyle's law. And then you also learn Ohm's law, that the voltage is equal to the current times the resistance. That's in electronics. You learn those two laws, you put them in your brain, and you learn twice as much. You need twice as many neurons. You dedicate some brain cells for Boyle's law, you dedicate some brain cells for Ohm's law. So if you're learning 1 million pieces of knowledge, you need 1 million, more neurons. If you're learning 2 million pieces of knowledge, you need 2 million neurons. So this blue line is what we call linear, or what I call linear learning. Logarithmic learning means you learn your increase in the number of neurons that you use, or the number of synapses that you use, does not increase linearly, but logarithmically. Which means that if you want to learn a lot, you actually use much less brain cells. You use less circuitry to learn more. So I want to ask a question, some of you, how is this possible? How is it possible to learn more with less? Any guesses?
Is it quicker? It's shorter?
Well, it's quicker. Well, it may or may not be quicker. But how is it possible to learn more material with less memory chips, for example? If that was possible, that would be pretty cool, right? Would you like to know the secret to doing that? And this is not about being lazy. In fact, before I give you the secret, if you're learning in the beginning, which technique requires more brain cells? The logarithmic approach or the linear one?
The logarithmic one?
Yes, the logarithmic actually requires more effort in the beginning. So that's a little bit of a secret to how this works. So it's not necessarily the lazy person's approach. In the long term, it is, okay, back to that. So how is it possible that you can learn more with less neurons over the long term? Okay, so this is actually the secret, is whenever you learn something, you make an effort to connect it to something that you already learned. So for example, Boyle's law is P times V is a constant. And Ohm's law in electricity is voltage equals current times resistance. But you can also say that the current is equal to the voltage divided by the resistance. Excuse me, voltage equals current times resistance. So PV is a constant, voltage is and IR multiplied by IR is a constant. So they're both linear relationships or inverse relationships of current and resistance and of pressure and volume. One is a gas law, the other one is an electronics law, but they're both inverse relationships, which means they follow the same mathematical structure. In other words, as pressure goes up, volume goes down. As current goes up, for a given voltage, resistance goes down, it has to be lower. So they are inverse relationships, so they're very related to each other. So you can imagine that if you're learning new things, but you are connecting it to previous knowledge, you actually have to learn or dedicate less sort of knowledge units to learn that knowledge. So the way to achieve this is to always be learning and connecting with your existing knowledge. The negative to this, the negative side, is that in the beginning there are two problems. One is in order to create this sort of nucleus of knowledge, you have to dedicate more neurons. It's more inefficient in the early stages of learning. The other problem is that if you learn things wrong in the beginning, or not optimally, it makes this early process more difficult. So this means actually that when you start your learning, it's actually harder, and it's extremely important to make sure what you're learning is as correct as possible in the beginning. But once you do that, once you have a very good solid basis and a very good framework, then adding new knowledge becomes much easier, and you learn much faster and more powerfully if you use this framework. Does that make sense? So why is this important for innovation? Well, I will end with a closing thought. We've talked about Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is very innovative, right? And he wrote, creativity is just connecting things. So if you get into a regular habit of learning and connecting things, then you are also building a mindset for innovation, which is connecting new things in different ways. So that is the connection between learning, connections, and innovation. Make sense? So creativity and learning, that's my quote now, is just connecting things. So next time we're going to talk about innovation in academia and business. We're going to talk about university research, corporate research labs, and how they do innovation. What are some of the techniques in R&D, a little bit more practical, etc. But this lecture may have started very strange for you, talking about neurons and neurobiology and action potentials, Why is he telling us this? But the final result is a very powerful message for learning. It builds on the neurobiology. That's why we went through that background. And it's also connected to fundamentally how we do innovation. It is a form of learning. And of course, good innovation is a form of very good learning. So that's the end of the lecture. Any questions?
Yes, I have one. I was thinking about can the brain decide what's important and what's not? Because as you've mentioned, the process behind it is just biochemical reactions. So I was thinking about, I mean, we younger people are a lot of time with our smartphones and checking social media.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
so
an excellent question, Marius. So how does the brain know what's important? During that sleep cycle, it's going to, as I mentioned, reduce all those connections and optimize them. And a couple of you mentioned about having a motivation or emotional connection to the learning. And we often view learning as a part of the rational brain. We don't get emotional about learning. We're not supposed to get emotional about learning. We're just supposed to study and write the equations and repeat it. But the question you asked, Marius, is why actually emotions exist. If we look at evolution, we've talked about evolution a lot. One reason for emotions is it is a way of the brain to give value to different experiences. If you're very afraid of something or something hurt you and you have a fear emotional response, you will remember that more. And the same with a very strong emotion in a positive way. So you want to find ways to also do the learning that you engage your motivation and your emotions in that process. I know that sounds very strange. So when you're learning something and you enjoy it, you will remember it better. That's why I showed you the artwork of Paul Klee, because he's not drawing, he talks what is understanding. I understand, right? That's not he's not showing you the rational process. He's showing you the emotional expression of it. And that was another message that I wanted to share by showing that slide. And so then you ask, why is he going to the museum to study? Because I wanted to find a way that I could emotionally keep engaged and motivated and interested and stimulated. And so engaging your emotional interest is very important. So I do a lot of teaching, and I actually try to engage your emotional interests so you don't forget, what I teach. Various techniques to do that. It's not as easy, of course, on Zoom, but that's a very good question. So the way the brain makes a value of information and says, I need to remember that, is the emotional connection to that information. And this is a little bit simplified, but that's essentially the concept. So that's a very good question.
yeah, I was really thinking about that a lot because I don't know, I have this hypothesis that humankind gets worse and worse in learning because yeah, we're so much like with our mobile phones and social media, and it's like a drug from the chemical or from the biological
Yeah.
side, because the body gives us dopamine when we are on social media.
And that's an
So
emotional, that's a replacement of an emotional response, by the way.
yeah, right.
So
That's
the solution to that is to create other emotional responses related. So if you're reading a book and you need to learn that, you need to have an environment that you're creating that dopamine in that context, as opposed to Facebooking or whatever it is, right?
yeah, that's the way.
And that's why I told you I went to the museum. First you were saying, why is this guy telling me this story about he's a student in the museum? How foolish is that, right? I bet you some of you are thinking, you know, that's weird. I go to the museum because I have to go and I want to see the art, and then I study at my desk. But I'm mixing them because that's innovative, and you don't forget. I still remember some of my, you know, medical knowledge I learned, and I remember what statues I was sitting next to in the museum, you know, studying, you know, anatomy and physiology. So that's an excellent question. You need to create the emotional environment of the interest. So you need to, you know, go back to exactly this painting and this feeling that Paul Klee captured in the painting. One who understands. Now that's going to be different for each person, but that's essentially what, if you want to be a master innovator and you want to be a master learner, that's what you have to do. Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
For you, which is the best way for you that you have been experienced and it's effective the most?
Say it again.
Which is the most effective in learning that you think that you have been like experienced and you think that is the best way of learning?
Well, as I said,
you.
For me, I think the best way to learn is whenever I see something new. Remember, innovation is related to new things, by the way, right? That's one reason why we're talking about learning in this innovation class. But if you see something new, I always think, how is that new thing related to what I already know? And that does two things. One is, if I can connect it to what I know, then I learn it much better using the logarithmic system, right? And then I am able to determine that maybe it's not so new because it's already connected to what I know. Or if it's connected to what I know, but in a different way, then maybe that's interesting and it could be a source of innovation. So one method, which is what I described at the final slide of this lecture, which was the whole point, is to constantly be connecting with what you already know. Now, I don't want to sound a little strange, you know, I'm older and you're students, so you don't know, you have not learned as much. You know a lot, but it's harder to connect with knowledge if you have less knowledge, right? So you're at a very important point that you want to be building up that nucleus of knowledge in a solid way that you can start to really easily integrate new knowledge to. So you should start that process. So it's actually more difficult for you than for me, not because I'm better or whatever, but because I have more of that knowledge and I've been doing it for much longer. So that's the main way that I learn. The second way that I learn is actually by teaching. If I can convince, if I can explain something in a way that I feel another person will understand, then I have probably achieved in my own mind what Paul Klee is trying to express here, a level of self-understanding. And you've heard this one, see one, do one, teach one, right? So ultimately teaching is a very powerful way to learn. But in the absence of that opportunity, as I said, this technique of logarithmic learning, which I described in the last slide here. Here, this technique of logarithmic learning is extremely, powerful. And as I emphasized, has application to innovation. Okay. So I uploaded the assignment. It's very simple. Think about it and just do one paragraph and send to me by Monday. Okay. I'll see you next week. Have a good week. Take care and keep on learning.
How about the midterm?
There is no midterm. We're going to have those three.
I know. I mean, like, when will you post the
short
assignment?
Yeah, the short assignments. Yeah. I will assign it next week. The reason for the delay, it's very interesting. Because of the COVID-19 quarantine situation, my original assignments were actually a little bit different. So I have to think of a different way to structure these assignments. These were kind of like a field trip, going out and seeing something. But it's a little bit more difficult in this situation. So I have to think about it a little bit more, and I will get you those short assignments. Okay?
Okay, Professor.
Don't worry about that. Okay, see you next week. Thank you, Professor. Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor.
Professor.